In this society, a girl without money has exactly one task: to disappear gracefully enough that no one is forced to witness it. She is not expected to dance. She is not expected to speak first. She is not expected at all, which is the kindest word they have for invisible. Eleanor Hartley was 22 years old, and she had learned this the way you learn the location of a loose stair, not from being told, but from falling. Her gown had been mended 3 times at the hem. Her gloves were white once, or close enough, and the left thumb had gone thin at the tip from the particular pressure of holding a pen. Her aunt, Meredith Crail, had brought her to the Fenwick Street reception, the way one brings an umbrella on a clear evening, not expecting to need it, but unwilling to be caught without. "No man will ever marry that girl," her aunt said, "to no one in particular, and to everyone at once." She adds figures in her head and corrects the servants. "What gentleman wants that at his breakfast table?" The room agreed, in the way rooms agree, without sound, without movement, with only a slight collective settling, like stones finding the bottom of a river. But when the door opened and the drawing room went quiet, a hand reached past her and pulled out the only empty chair. One motion, no explanation. That happened in front of all of London, and none of them understood why, least of all her. The reception at Fenwick Street was the kind that existed to be attended rather than enjoyed, and Eleanor had understood this distinction for long enough that she no longer expected anything else. The drawing room smelled of beeswax, forced roses, and the particular anxiety of women who had come to be seen making the correct choices. She stood near the east wall, which was not the best position and not the worst, and she held her reticule with both hands because there was nothing else to do with them, and because it gave her something to count the brass beads along the clasp. 7 of them, which she had counted before at 3 other receptions this season, and which had not changed. Her aunt was across the room, laughing at something Lord Beale had said. Meredith Crail laughed with her whole throat and her left hand on the nearest arm, and men found this charming. And Eleanor had watched her do it for 6 years and had never once found it in herself to imitate it. The sound carried. Most things about her aunt carried. Eleanor moved 2 steps to the left, toward the window, which gave her a view of the street and the faint sound of horses on the cobblestones below, which was more interesting than Lord Beale. The room was arranged around 2 settees and a scattering of gilt chairs, and all the chairs were occupied. Eleanor did not sit on the window ledge. Though she considered it, she stood, and her feet were beginning to register a quiet complaint about the evening, and she was calculating whether she could excuse herself to the hall for 10 minutes without her aunt noticing, when Meredith Crail's voice rose above the general noise of the room in that specific register that Eleanor recognized as deliberate. "She has always been this way," her aunt was saying, gesturing vaguely in Eleanor's direction without looking at her. "Precise. Efficient. She could tell you the yield on every field at Ashcombe Grange to the last bushel. I'm certain. But what gentleman wants a wife who corrects his steward at dinner?" She paused for exactly the right beat. The beat that invited laughter. "No man will ever marry that girl. She has nothing to offer but a set of figures she can add in her head." The laughter was not unkind. That was the worst of it. There was no malice in it, only recognition. The comfortable recognition of a thing everyone already knew being confirmed aloud. Eleanor did not change her expression. She had learned very early that changing her expression cost something she could not afford in a room like this, and so she looked at the window and noted that the street below had emptied of horses, and she counted the brass beads, and she did not move. The door opened. She heard the room change before she saw why. There was a shift in the air, a particular quality of silence that was not absence of sound but rearrangement of attention, all the small conversations pausing at once. The way candle flames all bend the same direction when a window is opened. Eleanor turned from the window. Hugh Vane, Duke of Marlstoke, stood in the doorway. She knew him by reputation only, which was the way most of London knew him, a man who attended fewer events than he was invited to, which given his rank meant he still attended more than most people existed. 32 years old. The dukedom had come to him at 24 after a fever took his father and his elder brother within the same fortnight, which was the kind of inheritance that left a mark, though people disagreed on what kind. There was a scar along his left jaw, faint but present. Origin, unspecified and unasked about. He was not a large man, but he occupied a room in the way that certain pieces of furniture do, by being exactly where they were supposed to be, and making everything else seem provisional. He spoke briefly to the hostess, Lady Fenwick, who touched her collar and smiled with all of her face in a way she had not smiled at anyone else that evening. Then he moved into the room, and the room reorganized itself around him without anyone appearing to do so deliberately. Eleanor turned back to the window. This was not her event. The arrival of the Duke of Marlstoke was even less her event. She noted the horses had returned to the street below a grey and a bay. The grey, impatient, and she was counting the brass beads again. 4, 5, and she was aware of someone approaching from her left only because the particular warmth of candlelight shifted, and then a hand reached past her. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a single motion, a hand closing around the back of the only empty chair in that half of the room and drawing it to the side, positioning it so the seat faced the window and the wall simultaneously, so that a person sitting in it could see the street without being fully turned toward the room. He did not look at her aunt. He did not look at Lord Beale, or the settees, or the women who had shifted to watch. He set the chair down, and he straightened, and he looked at Eleanor Hartley with an expression that said nothing at all beyond the fact of the action itself. She sat down. She was not sure. Afterward, why she had. It was not gratitude, exactly, and it was not obedience, and it was not because she had understood the gesture. It was more that refusing seemed to require an explanation she did not have. The room processed this in silence for 2 seconds. Then the small conversations resumed, at a slightly higher register, with a slightly different subject. Her aunt had gone still on the other side of the room. Eleanor could see her in the edge of her vision, not looking directly, and what she could see was that her aunt's left hand had come away from Lord Beale's arm and was now closed at her side. Meredith Crail was a woman who planned well and adjusted quickly, and Eleanor recognized the moment of adjustment, the slight recalibration, the decision to wait and understand before reacting. It was a skill Eleanor admired without warmth. The Duke stood near her. He did not sit, there was no chair for him, and he did not ask for one. He stood as though standing were simply what he had intended to do in this part of the room. After a moment, he said, without preamble and without looking at her directly, Ashcombe Grange, Derbyshire. It was not a question. Eleanor looked at him. Yes, she said. The South Field. They switched the crop rotation 3 years ago. She had not expected that. She said, carefully, 4 years ago. The drainage was wrong for what they'd been planting. He turned his head slightly. The scar along his jaw caught the candlelight and disappeared again, and the yield since improved the first 2 years. The third was poor because of the spring. The fourth recovered. She paused. You've seen the land records. I've seen land records for most of Derbyshire. He said, it was not a boast. It was the way one might say I've been to Derbyshire, a fact, belonging to a category of facts. Eleanor looked at the window. The grey horse was still impatient. She said, "That is a great many records." "It is," he agreed, and something in his voice shifted by a fraction that she could not name. Not warmth, not humour. Exactly. Something adjacent. Her aunt crossed the room in the particular way that Meredith Crail crossed rooms when she had decided something purposeful but unhurried, with a smile already arranged for a specific target. She arrived at Eleanor's elbow and deployed the smile at the Duke. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. I was not certain you attended Lady Fenwick's gatherings." "I don't," he said, "as a rule." A beat. Her aunt's smile did not waver. "My niece, Eleanor Hartley. I believe you've been introduced. We've been speaking," he said, not dismissive, factual, in the same register as everything else he had said. He looked at her aunt with the particular quality of attention that Eleanor recognized as not attention at all, but its precise mirror, a gaze that held its position without offering anything behind it. Meredith Crail was a woman who read rooms well. Eleanor watched her read this one. Something in her aunt's expression shifted a tiny renegotiation, visible only to someone who knew the face well, and then she smiled again, a different smile, and said she must return to Lady Fenwick, and withdrew. Eleanor did not watch her go. She looked at the street, and then at her gloves, and then at the Duke, who had not moved. "You heard what she said," Eleanor said. It was not a question either. He looked at her gloves, the left thumb, the thin place, then back at her face. "Yes," he said. She expected something further, and he offered nothing. She said, "It did not appear to affect your opinion." "Correcting a steward at dinner," he said, "is a quality I find more useful than the alternative." He paused, in the particular way of someone who does not pause often. "I would like to call on your father." Eleanor's hands went still on the brass beads. She counted them again, not because she needed to, but because it gave her a half-second to arrange the inside of her expression before anything showed on the outside of it. 4, 5, cease, 7, to discuss the land records, she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a correction. "To discuss other matters," he said. She held his gaze. The room was still rearranged around him, and the candles were warm, and the brass beads were the same as they had always been, and she was aware that something had just happened that she did not yet have a framework for, and that she would need to sit with it the way you sit, with a set of figures that don't balance, not with panic, but with the quiet determination to find the error. "My father receives callers on Thursday mornings," she said. "Thursday," he repeated, as though entering it somewhere. He did not stay much longer. When he left, the room reorganized itself again, back toward its original configuration, though not all the way. Some conversations had shifted. Some clusters of people had moved, and her aunt was watching her from across the room with an expression Eleanor had not seen her wear before. She sat in the chair until the reception ended. No one asked her to give it up. Thursday came with fog and the particular quiet of a morning that has decided not to announce itself. Eleanor was at the escritoire in the front room when the Duke arrived, which meant she heard the knock and heard her father's shuffling progress down the hall and heard the drawing-room door close behind 2 sets of footsteps, and then heard nothing for the better part of an hour, because the walls at the Hartley house on Cheapside were thick enough to muffle anything that was not raised in anger. She did not move from the escritoire. She had the household accounts open in front of her, the real ones, the ones she kept separate from the ones her aunt reviewed, and she worked through them with the same attention she brought to everything, which was complete and unhurried, and contained a specific quality of dread she had learned to fold very small. The numbers had not improved since last quarter. The numbers had not improved since the quarter before that, either, and the pattern was one she understood in the way that you understand. A slow leak, not sudden, not dramatic, but accumulating toward a point where the damage would be structural. She noted 3 line items that did not match their corresponding receipts and wrote the discrepancy in the margin in pencil, not ink, because pencil could be erased if she found the error was hers. It was not hers. She had checked. The drawing-room door opened at 10:15. She heard her father's voice in the hall, a particular warmth in it that she recognized as relief, the way men sound when a problem has been handed to someone with broader shoulders, and then she heard the door. And then her father was standing in the entrance to the front room, and he was looking at her with an expression she had only seen him wear once before, the morning he had told her mother had died. "Eleanor," he said, "come and sit down." She came and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap, which was something she did when she needed her face to stay steady. Her father sat across from her in the chair with the worn armrest. He had never had it reupholstered, even when they could have afforded to, because it had been her mother's, and he said, "The Duke of Marlstoke has asked for your hand." She looked at him. He did not quite meet her eyes. She said, "He mentioned he wished to call." "He has called," her father said, "and he has made his terms. He will assume the outstanding debts on Ashcombe Grange, the tenants' arrears, the roof, the drainage on the south field, which I told him you already knew about, and he said he was aware." Her father stopped. His hands, folded over his knee, were the hands of a man who had been a country gentleman all his life and had never quite managed the books of it. He asks nothing in return. No dowry, he made that plain. Only that the arrangement proceed quickly and quietly. Eleanor looked at the window behind her father's head. The fog had not lifted. She said, "He asks nothing in return." That is what he said. She considered this the way she considered any number that did not make sense, with the understanding that it did make sense somewhere, and that the error was in her reading of it rather than in the figure itself. Men like Hugh Vane, Duke of Marlstoke, did not assume the debts of a Derbyshire family of no particular consequence and ask for nothing. That was not how the accounting worked. There was always a figure on the other side of the ledger. "Did he say why?" she said. Her father looked at his hands. "He said Ashcombe Grange is good land, managed poorly, and that he expects it to be managed better." "By whom?" Her father did not answer that, which was, she understood, its own answer. She was married at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a Tuesday morning in early April, with 5 people in attendance, which was the number her aunt had deemed sufficient to satisfy propriety without advertising the irregularity of the arrangement. The weather was indifferent. Eleanor wore her second-best dress because her best had a tear at the sleeve she had not finished mending, and she carried a small bunch of violets that Nan had cut from the kitchen garden at Cheapside before dawn and tied with a piece of ribbon she had unwound from her own hair. Eleanor had told her it was unnecessary. Nan had told her to be quiet and hold still. Hugh Vane stood at the altar with the stillness of a man who had made a decision and arrived at the execution of it without residual uncertainty. He did not look at her when she entered, not until she was beside him, and then he looked at her with the same quality of attention he had given her at Fenwick Street, complete and opaque, and giving nothing away about what lay behind it. He said the words correctly. She said the words correctly. The register was signed, the witnesses signed, and they walked out into the April air as the Duke and Duchess of Marlstoke, and the carriage was waiting, and her aunt was standing at the bottom of the steps, with a smile that Eleanor recognized as the kind worn over the top of something else. "You will be very happy," her aunt said, which was not something Meredith Crail usually said, and the saying of it placed a small, cold stone in Eleanor's chest that she carried into the carriage and did not examine until they were an hour out of London. Leavenworth was 3 hours north of the city, through country that flattened and then lifted and then flattened again into the kind of landscape that did not ask anything of you, which Eleanor found restful. The house came into view around a long curve in the drive grey stone. 2 wings. Very old. Well kept in the way that things are kept. Well when no expense is spared on maintenance and no thought is given to ornament. The gardens were orderly. There were no flowers in them. The entrance hall smelled of cold stone, linseed oil, and paper, the particular smell of a house that was used for work. The housekeeper, a spare woman named Hesba Dunnet, who moved as though she had been installed in the house at the same time as the floors, showed Eleanor to her rooms and explained the schedule of the house in the tone of someone reading from a document that had not been revised in some years. Breakfast was served at 8 in the morning in the small dining room. His Grace typically took his breakfast in the study. Dinner was at 7 in the evening. Formal dress not required, though the standard of the house was, "Does he take dinner in the study as well?" Eleanor said. Hesba paused for exactly 1 beat. "His Grace dines in the dining room." "Your Grace, but not at breakfast." "His Grace has kept his own schedule," since another pause, "for some years." Eleanor looked around her rooms. They were large, well-proportioned, furnished in the manner of the previous generation, good pieces, slightly dated, nothing chosen recently. A writing desk sat beneath the east window, facing the garden. On the desk was a tray with a single teacup, still faintly warm, with the tea already made. She lifted the cup and smelled it. Black, with nothing added. Steeped the correct length of time. She drank it standing at the window and looked at the orderly garden with its absence of flowers. And she thought about the figure on the other side of the ledger. And she did not yet know what it was. The first week at Leavenworth established itself around her, the way weather establishes itself not by announcement but by accumulation. She ate breakfast alone in the small dining room. She ate dinner across the table from her husband, who spoke when he had something to say and did not otherwise fill the silence, and who she was slowly learning to read the way you read a text in a language you know imperfectly by inference, by context, by the shape of what was not said. He asked, on the 3rd evening, whether she had looked at the Leavenworth accounts. She had. He asked what she thought. She told him, item by item, with the margins she had noted. He listened without interrupting, which she had not expected, and when she finished he said, "The timber estimate on page 4 is wrong." She turned it over in her head and said, "The surveyor used last year's rate. This year's rate would put it higher by about 1/5. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite its absence. He said, "Yes." The tea appeared every morning on the writing desk. She asked Nan, who had come with her from Cheapside, because Eleanor had told her father that Nan was part of the arrangement and had not waited for him to agree. Nan said she did not make the tea. Eleanor asked Hesba, who said she had not been instructed to provide it and therefore could not account for it, which was the kind of answer that was technically true and deeply uninformative. Eleanor stopped asking. Her aunt came to Leavenworth on the 9th day, unannounced, in the way her aunt did things she knew would not be welcomed, arriving before resistance could organize. Eleanor received her in the smaller sitting room, which was a choice, and which she knew her aunt would read correctly, and which she made anyway. Meredith Crail looked around the sitting room with the expression of a woman making assessments she would share selectively. She accepted tea and did not drink it, and said that Eleanor seemed to be settling in, and Eleanor said that she was, and her aunt said that Leavenwood was very quiet, and Eleanor agreed that it was. There was a particular quality to conversations with her aunt that Eleanor thought of as controlled weather. Her aunt decided when the rain came and how hard. "Your father is well," her aunt said. "He is relieved. I think he does not say so. But I know him." She set down the teacup. "He signed the papers last autumn without entirely understanding them. You know, that is always the difficulty with your father. He trusts the person in front of him and reads the document later." She said it with the warmth of a woman describing a family weakness, fond, not critical, nothing that could be held up as accusation. "There was a paper last October, something to do with Ashcombe. He signed it. I dealt with it. That is generally how we manage." Eleanor looked at her. "What paper?" "Oh, a routine matter." Her aunt's hand moved. A gesture of dismissal. "I resolved it entirely. You need not think about it." The smile arranged itself. "You have a great deal more to think about now, I would imagine." She left shortly after. Eleanor sat in the smaller sitting room for a few minutes after the sound of the carriage faded from the drive, and she looked at the cold teacup her aunt had left, and she thought about papers signed in October and routine matters resolved entirely. And she put these next to the line items in the Ashcombe accounts that did not match their receipts. And she let the figures sit together the way you let a set of numbers sit when you know they belong to the same problem, but have not yet found the equation that connects them. She went to the dining room at 7. Her husband was already there. He looked at her when she came in the quality of attention, complete and opaque, and then, at the chair across from him, she sat down. She said, "My aunt visited today." "I know," he said. "Hesba told me." She mentioned a paper my father signed in October, to do with Ashcombe. Something shifted, very slightly, in the set of his jaw. She saw it the way you see a change in wind direction, not the wind itself, but the thing it moved. He picked up his fork. He said, "Did she say what kind of paper?" "She said it was routine," Eleanor said, "and that she had resolved it." He set the fork down again. He looked at the table between them, not at her, and she had the clear and sudden impression of a man doing arithmetic of his own. He said, "After dinner, come to the study." She did not ask why. She said, "Yes." And they ate dinner in the particular silence of Leavenwood, which was the silence of a house that had been quiet for a long time and did not know yet whether it was going to be asked to change. The study at Leavenwood smelled of ink, cold leather, and the ash of a fire that had been allowed to go out and relit so many times that the grate had taken on a permanent grey tinge. 3 walls were shelves. The 4th was windows, facing north, which meant the light was steady and colourless and good for reading figures without illusion. Eleanor understood immediately why he worked here. It was the room in the house that was most resistant to comfort, and some people, she was learning, did their best thinking in rooms that did not try to help. He had 3 ledgers open on the desk when she came in. He did not look up. He said, "Sit," not unkindly, in the tone of a man who says what he means and does not ornament it. She sat in the chair across from the desk, which was a working chair rather than a visitor's chair, and she looked at the ledgers and recognized the format, Ashcombe Grange, the same accounts she kept at home, but older, the entries going back further than the copies she had. He turned the 3rd ledger to face her and pointed to a page. "October of last year," he said. "This line." She leaned forward. The entry was for a transfer of management authority, a legal instrument registered through a solicitor in London, countersigned by a representative. The figure in the next column was 0, the note in the margin. in a handwriting that was not her father's and not the estate steward's, read by separate instrument, executed, same date. Eleanor looked at this for a long moment. She looked at the handwriting. She said, "That is my aunt's hand." "Yes," he said. "What is the separate instrument?" He was quiet for a moment that she understood as deliberate, not evasion but precision. The pause of a man who wanted to say the exact thing and not a neighboring thing. He said, "A power of attorney over the management of Ashcombe Grange, broad in scope, signed by your father, witnessed by a solicitor your aunt retained." Eleanor kept her eyes on the page. The ink was very clear, the way old ink gets when it has dried completely and settled into the paper. She said, "He would not have understood what he was signing." "No," Hugh said. "The instrument was described to him, I believe, as a routine authorization for estate correspondence. And it was not. It was not." She sat back. She was aware of the fire behind her and the north light from the windows and the particular quality of the room's silence, which was a thinking silence. And she thought, she said, "Who holds it now?" He picked up the pen he had set down when she came in, not to write with, but to hold, in the way she held the brass beads, something to occupy the hands while the mind worked. He said, "I do." She looked at him. He met her gaze directly for the first time since she had come into the room, and she saw in his face the thing she had been trying to read for 2 weeks, not warmth, not apology, but something that she could only describe as the expression of a man who is waiting to be judged and has decided to stand still for it. "You bought it," she said, "from the creditor your aunt had assigned it to." "Yes, 6 weeks before our marriage." She counted this, the way she counted other things. 6 weeks. He had known about the instrument before he came to Fenwick Street. He had known when he pulled out the chair. He had known at the altar and in the carriage, and across every dinner in this north-facing room. She said, "And you did not tell me." "No," he said. "Why?" He set the pen down. He said, "Because your aunt did not yet know I had it. And if she had known, she would have moved faster than we could." He paused. "I needed her to believe the situation was still recoverable on her end." Eleanor looked at the ledger. Then she looked at the windows, the colorless northern light. She said, "We," very quietly, and left the observation where it was. She took the ledger with her when she left. He did not ask for it back. She sat at the writing desk in her room until past midnight, with 3 candles, and the household accounts she had brought from Cheapside, and the Ashcombe records from the study. And she built the full picture, the way you build any picture, from partial information carefully, from the outside in, checking each piece against the others before committing it to the structure. By the time the last candle began to gutter, she had the shape of it entire. Her aunt had been drawing funds from the Ashcombe estate account for 6 years. Not large amounts at once, never dramatic, always attributed to legitimate expenses, repairs, wages, the incidental costs of managing a property from a distance. The total, across 6 years, was significant. The power of attorney was the final mechanism with it. Meredith Crowell could have formalized her control of Ashcombe Grange completely, transferred assets, renegotiated tenancies, operated the estate as her own, while Eleanor's father continued to believe himself in possession of it. Eleanor blew out the last candle and sat in the dark for a moment. She was not angry yet. Anger was a thing she had learned to place at a slight distance from herself until she understood what it was useful for. What she felt instead was the precise, clarifying sensation of a problem becoming solvable, not easy, not painless, but solvable, and the separate and distinct discomfort of not being the person who had been first to solve it. He had known. He had acted. He had not told her. She went to sleep at 1:15 in the morning, and when she woke at 7, the tea was on the desk again, the correct temperature, and she drank it, standing at the window the same way she had on the first morning, but with the different weight of someone who now knows which door they are standing in front of, even if they have not yet decided whether to open it. The improvement in the dining room arrangement happened without either of them acknowledging it. The morning after, she had sat in the study. She came down to find a second place set at the breakfast table. She sat. He was already there, reading correspondence. He did not explain the second place setting, and she did not ask him to. And they ate in the same silence as dinner, which was beginning to feel less like absence and more like a particular language that only had words for necessary things. She found her use in the household the way water finds a low place, not by looking for it, but by following the natural gradient of what needed doing. The tenants' accounts were in worse condition than the Leavenwood ledgers showed, because the ledgers had been compiled by a steward who rounded in his own favor, and who had been doing so for long enough that he was no longer careful about it. She brought this to her husband's attention across the breakfast table on a Wednesday morning, the 2nd week of May, placing the discrepancy in 3 figures before him without preface. He looked at them for a long moment. He said, "He has been with the estate for 11 years. She said, "He has been rounding for at least 4. He looked at her, then at the figures. Then he picked up his pen and wrote 3 words at the bottom of the page, a note to himself, she assumed, or to his solicitor. He turned the page back to her. It said, "Find a replacement." She found one. She interviewed 4 candidates in the study, with the north light coming in, and Hugh Vane sitting at his desk, reading correspondence and not participating, which she understood was the point that she was being given the authority to choose without being watched doing it. She chose a man named Ned Kessel, who was 27 and had managed a smaller estate in Yorkshire, and who gave precise answers and did not attempt to explain her questions back to her. When she told Hugh, he said, "Good," and returned to his correspondence, and she went back to the tenants' accounts. The village was 3 miles from the house, and she began walking it on Thursday afternoons, after she discovered that the previous steward had not visited in 8 months, and that several of the tenants were owed repairs that had been promised and not made. She went without ceremony, which Hesba had initially found disturbing, and she listened to what people told her and wrote it down and brought it back and gave it to Ned Kessel to act on. The tenants called her the Duchess, which was the correct form and took some getting used to. One old woman, whose name was Hesba the Elder, to distinguish her from Hesba the housekeeper, called her Miss Eleanor, which was wrong and felt more accurate. It was on one of these Thursday afternoons, in the middle of the 2nd month, that she encountered Dunnet, not Hesba, the housekeeper, the other Dunnet, whose first name was apparently also William, and who was her husband's solicitor, a thin man of 60 with the hands of someone who wrote for a living and had never much stopped. He was leaving the house as she was returning from the village, and he held the door and said, "Your Grace," and she said, "Mr. Dunnet," and then her aunt's carriage came around the corner of the drive. Dunnet's face did not change. That was the thing she noticed, not a flicker, not a tightening. He simply looked at the carriage for a fraction of a second, longer than he looked at anything else. And then he said his goodbyes and went to his own horse and left. She stood in the entrance and watched the carriage, and she thought about that fraction of a second. Her aunt entered the house with the same ease she entered everything. The ease of a woman who has never been turned away and has learned to use this as a fact rather than a privilege. She was charming to Hesba and to Nan, and she looked around the entrance hall of Leavenwood with an expression of someone revising an estimate upward. She said that she was in the area, which was untrue. Leavenwood was not in the area of anywhere her aunt went, and that she had wanted to see how Eleanor was finding it all. "I am finding it well," Eleanor said. They sat in the drawing room, not the smaller sitting room this time, because her aunt had moved toward it, and Eleanor had not redirected her. They had tea. Her aunt asked about the house, about the tenants, about the steward, about Eleanor's health, in the order that a woman asks questions when the question she wants to ask is something else. "Your husband is not here," her aunt said. "Not a question. He is in the study." "Of course." Her aunt smiled. "He is always somewhere working. I have heard he is formidable in that regard." "He is thorough," Eleanor said. Her aunt looked at her with the expression she wore when she was deciding how much to say and in what order to say it. Then she said, "Eleanor, I want you to know that I am glad this has worked out well. I worried when the arrangement was made so quickly. But you are a practical girl, and this seems to suit you." "It does," Eleanor said. "And the Duke," her aunt's tone was precisely neutral. "He treats you well. He treats me as a person of sense," Eleanor said, "which is all I have ever asked of anyone." Her aunt was quiet for a moment. Then, in the voice she used when she wanted to seem to be offering something rather than taking something, "I have been thinking of visiting Ashcombe in August. To check on things. I do like to keep an eye on the property." She lifted her teacup. "Old habits." "The property." Eleanor kept her face entirely still. She said, "I am sure that can be arranged." After her aunt left, Eleanor went to the study. She knocked, and he said, "Come in," and she came in and closed the door and said, "Without sitting down, my aunt intends to visit Ashcombe in August." He had been writing. He stopped. He said, without turning around, "I know. Dunnett told you," Eleanor said. A pause. "Yes." She stood in the doorway of the study with the north light coming in over his shoulder and the smell of ink and cold leather around her. And she said, "How much does she not yet know about what you have done?" He turned then. He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand as the face he wore when he was deciding to tell the truth rather than a careful version of it. He said, "She knows I bought the power of attorney. She does not know what I intend to do with it. She believes she may still negotiate its return." "And can she?" "No," he said. It was very flat. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the fraction of a second in which Dunnett had looked at her aunt's carriage, and about the line of her aunt's hand in the estate ledger, and about the word "we" that she had left on the table between them 10 days ago. She said, "Then we should discuss what you do intend to do with it." He pulled out the chair across from his desk. Not the visitor's chair, a chair he had brought from somewhere. Newer, better angled. He set it in front of the desk and looked at her. She sat down. He sat down. He opened the ledger between them. They did not finish until the hall clock struck 9. By the time Eleanor went upstairs, she had the full account of what he had assembled and what he had not yet been able to prove. And she had told him 3 things he had not known. And he had written them all down with the same attention he brought to everything complete. Precisi, giving nothing away about what it cost him to have been told them by her, rather than finding them himself. That Sunday, at the village church of St. Andrew's, her aunt arrived uninvited and sat in the 3rd pew. After the service, in the church porch with half the parish looking on, Meredith Crail said, in the tone of someone observing rather than declaring, "The tenants seem to like her, though I suppose anyone seems capable after Kessel's predecessor." She turned to Eleanor with the smile that covered other things. "You have always been very competent, Eleanor. Useful. But then, useful and wanted are not quite the same thing." "Are they?" She said it gently. She said it in front of Hesba the elder and 2 tenant wives and a young man whose lease renewal was pending. The small, cold stone that had been sitting in Eleanor's chest since the wedding came back, harder and heavier than before, because her aunt had found the exact load-bearing wall and pressed on it not maliciously, or not only maliciously, but accurately, and the accuracy of it was what made Eleanor's hands still on her prayer book rather than her aunt's words. She did not look at her husband. She looked at the church porch stones, which were old and uneven, and had been walked on by a great many people who had not been destroyed by it. From slightly behind her and to the left, in a tone that was barely above conversational, Hugh Vane said, "Useful is one word for it." He paused, the way he paused when he was being precise. The tenants on the north field would use another. So would the families whose arrears were restructured this spring. He did not look at her aunt while he said this. He looked at Eleanor. "I find I am not interested in the distinction you are drawing, Lady Meredith." He offered Eleanor his arm. She took it. They walked to the carriage. Behind them, the porch was very quiet. The ride back from St. Andrews was 3 miles, and they did not speak for 2 of them. Eleanor watched the hedgerows through the carriage window, the early summer growth thick and undifferentiated, and she thought about what her aunt had said, and about the way Hugh had answered it, and about the specific quality of the silence in the carriage now, which was different from the dining room silence, and different from the study silence. It was a silence that had weight in it, the weight of something that had been moved and not yet set down. He spoke first, which surprised her. He said, without preface, she was not wrong. Eleanor turned from the window. He was looking at the opposite hedge, his hands on his knees, the scar along his jaw in profile. She said, "About which part?" "That useful and wanted are not the same thing." He paused in the precise way. She was using it as a weapon. "That does not mean the observation is incorrect." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She said, "Are you telling me this because you think I need reassurance, or because you find the distinction worth examining?" He turned his head then, and looked at her with the complete, opaque attention, and something behind it, not warmth, not yet, or not what she would have called warmth before she had learned to read. This particular face shifted. He said, "The second." "Good," she said, and turned back to the window, and they did not speak again until the carriage pulled onto the Leavenwood Drive, and she was aware, in the particular way of someone who does not deceive herself about her own accounting, that something in the figure on the other side of the ledger had become slightly more legible. She did not go to the study after dinner that evening. She went to the library, which was the room in the house she had spent the least time in, because the study was where the work was, and the library was where the work used to be. In some earlier version of the house, the shelves were organized and the books read, and there was a particular chair near the west window that had been sat in so many times. The leather had shaped itself around the memory of a person. She did not know whose person. She sat in a different chair and read through her notes from the previous week and listened to the house settle around her, the way old stone houses settle in summer, and she did not think about her aunt's words, which she was thinking about very carefully, by not thinking about them at all. He came to find her at 9:30. He stood in the doorway and looked at her and said, "Come to the study." She came. He had the desk cleared of everything except one document, a single page, handwritten, with a seal at the bottom she recognized as a legal instrument. He set a chair beside him rather than across from him, which was not what he usually did, and she sat in it, close enough to read the page without it being turned to face her. She read it. It was the power of attorney, the original, not a copy, not a summary in a ledger. The actual instrument her father had signed in October, with the solicitor's seal and her aunt's countersignature, and the blank in the middle where the scope of authority was written out in the particular language of legal documents that was designed to be comprehensive and was. Eleanor's father's signature was at the bottom, George Hartley, in the slightly unsteady hand he had developed in the last 2 years. The signature of a man who had stopped reading before he signed. She read it twice. She read the scope clause 3 times. The way you read a figure that keeps coming out differently, with the increasing certainty that the figure is the same each time, and that the reading of it is what you have been hoping will change. She set it down. She said, "You have had this since before we were married." "Yes," he said. "You bought it from the creditor your aunt assigned it to." "Yes." "Before you came to Fenwick Street." 3 weeks before. She looked at the page. Then she looked at the north windows. Dark. Now. Reflecting the lamplight back at her. She said, "You came to Fenwick Street because you had already decided to address this and you needed—" She stopped. Not because she did not know the end of the sentence, but because she wanted to say it correctly. You needed someone to hold the title. Pauser. Then, in a tone that was the flattest she had heard from him, which she was coming to understand meant he was being most careful. That was not the only reason. She looked at him. He was looking at the page rather than at her. The way he looked at figures that he was working through. The lamplight put a warm edge on the grey at his temples that the daylight did not, and the scar along his jaw was a shadow in it. And she thought about what Hesba had said. His Grace has kept his own schedule for some years, and about the chair in the library that had been shaped by someone who was no longer there, and about what it cost a man who ran everything by transaction to have acted on something that was not one. She said, "What was the other reason?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, still looking at the page, "I heard what she said to you. At Fenwick Street. Before I came in. Pauser. I was in the hall for several minutes before I entered the drawing room. The walls are not as thick as people assume." He picked up the pen he had set down, held it in the same way. "You did not change your expression." Eleanor said nothing. "Most people," he said, "change their expression. Or they leave the room. Or they say something to restore their own position." He set the pen down again. "You counted something. On your reticule. And you stayed." She thought about the brass beads. 4, 5, number 6, 7, she said. "It is a useful habit." "Yes," he said. And then, in a tone so stripped of its usual precision that it landed differently, "It is not only useful." She looked at the power of attorney on the desk. She looked at his hands, which were still, the pen set down, the document between them. She thought about the tea on the writing desk each morning at the correct temperature, and the chair beside him rather than across, and the way he had said "we," without appearing to notice he had said it. She thought about the list she did not yet know existed, but was already, in some way, she had not yet named, beginning to suspect. She said, "You should have told me. About the document. Before the wedding. Or after. But before this." She said it without heat. The way. She noted a discrepancy in the accounts as a fact, as something that needed to be entered in the record. "I have been living in this house for 2 months, making decisions about people and property, without knowing that the most important piece of information about my own situation was in the desk 10 feet from where I ate dinner." He did not argue this. He said, "Yes. It was not your information to manage." "No," he said, "it was not." She looked at him and he looked back at her, and it was the first time she could remember that his gaze had no opacity behind it, not warmth exactly. Not yet, but the absence of the door he usually kept shut. and the absence felt like its own kind of declaration from a man who did not make declarations. He said, "I did not know how to give it to you without it being—" He stopped. He tried again, in the way of a man unaccustomed to trying the second time. "Everything in this house runs on instruments, agreements, defined terms. I am better at those than at the other kind." Eleanor looked at the power of attorney. She said, "The other kind. The kind where you simply tell a person the truth and wait." Pause. I find waiting difficult." She nearly said something. She stopped herself, the way she stopped herself at the accounts when a figure looked like it balanced, but she had not yet checked the source. She said instead, "My aunt plans to come to Ashcombe in August. She believes she can still negotiate the return of that document." "She cannot," he said. "She will try, and when she discovers she cannot, she will look for another instrument. She is not a woman who accepts a closed door." Eleanor thought of the smile that covered other things, and the warmth that was calculation, and the 6 years of careful, small withdrawals that had never tipped into accusable theft. She will look for something that makes her position legal enough to argue. "There is nothing," he said. "There will be," Eleanor said, "if we wait long enough." She looked at him. "We should not wait." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you propose?" She thought about the ledgers, and the scope clause, and the 6 years of figures that did not match their receipts, and what it would mean to put them all in the same room with a solicitor and a witness and a document that could not be argued away. She said, "I propose we invite my aunt to Leavenwood before August, before she has time to prepare." She looked at the page. "I propose we show her what we have." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had learned to wait for, the one where the calculation concluded and something settled. He said, "When?" She said, 2 weeks. "Give Dunnett time to prepare the full accounting." She paused. "And give me time to find the one thing she does not know we have." He looked at her. "Which is," she said, "the receipts. The actual receipts from the 6 years, not the estate copies. The originals will be in London, in her house. Because she is meticulous, and she would not have destroyed them. She would have kept them in case she ever needed to produce them, as proof of her own legitimacy. She would not expect anyone to ask for them." She met his gaze. "I know where she keeps things she does not want found. I lived in her house for 3 years. He was quiet for 2 seconds. He said, "Can you get them?" She said, "Nan can get them. Nan has a sister in service 2 streets from my aunt's house. It is not the kind of retrieval that requires explanation." She looked at him steadily. "It is the kind that requires trust." He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he nodded. "Once," and picked up the pen, and began to write. And Eleanor sat beside him and told him what to write and in what order. And outside the north windows, the summer dark lay over Leavenwood, and the garden with its absence of flowers. And the hall clock struck 10, and neither of them moved to end the meeting until it was done. She stood to leave. She had her hand on the door when he said, "Behind her," in the voice that was most stripped Eleanor. She turned. He was still at the desk, not looking at her, looking at what he had written. He said, "I am aware that this arrangement was not what you would have chosen." She looked at him. She thought about Fenwick Street and the chair and the brass beads. She said, "You do not know what I would have chosen." She left the door slightly open behind her, which was a choice, and which she knew he would read correctly, and which she made anyway. Eleanor went to London on a Tuesday, which was the day her aunt held her regular correspondence mornings and would be occupied at her writing desk from 9 until noon. She did not tell Hugh she was going until the evening before, and when she told him, he said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Take the better carriage," and she understood this to mean he was not going to argue and was not going to come with her, which were both the correct decisions and which she was grateful for without saying so. She and Nan left at 6:30 in the morning, while the mist was still in the low fields. Nan sat across from her and ate an apple and did not make conversation, which Eleanor valued above most of her other qualities. The road was good until the last 10 miles, and then was not, and they arrived in London at 10:15, and Nan got out at the corner of Fenwick Street, and Eleanor continued to Dunnett's office near the Strand. She had sent word ahead. Dunnet received her in his office, which smelled of old documents and the particular dustiness of a room where the windows are never quite opened far enough. He was courteous and precise, and he had the full accounting ready, 6 years of Ashcombe withdrawals laid against the estate records, a thorough and damning document that was also, by itself, incomplete. He looked at her over the desk and said, carefully, "Your Grace, I must advise you that without the original receipts, what we have is strongly suggestive but not conclusive. A skilled advocate could argue the estate accounts are themselves in error." Eleanor said, "I know. I am waiting for the receipts." Dunnet looked at the clock on his wall. "And if they cannot be retrieved," she said, "they can be retrieved." She said it the way she said figures she had already checked, not with optimism, but with the specific certainty of having done the arithmetic. She waited in Dunnet's outer office for 1 hour and 40 minutes, which she spent reading through the accounting he had prepared, and finding 2 places where his figures and her figures differed, and noting them in pencil. At 12:30, Nan came in through the outer door with a canvas satchel held against her side, and her expression arranged into something that on another face would have been called serene. Eleanor opened the satchel. The receipts were there, 6 years of them, tied in separate bundles by year, in the handwriting of 3 different record keepers employed at intervals by Meredith Crawley, all of them bearing the Ashcombe Grange estate heading, and none of them matching the figures in the estate accounts. She looked at the first bundle for 30 seconds, and then she closed the satchel and looked at Nan and said, "Thank you." Nan said, "My sister says hello." Eleanor brought the satchel into Dunnet's office and set it on his desk. He opened it and looked at the first bundle for considerably longer than 30 seconds. Then he looked up at her and said, in the tone of a man revising an estimate, "Your Grace." A pause. "This is conclusive." "Yes," she said, "it is. How long do you need?" He said, "A week to prepare the formal instrument, 2 to have it fully registered." He paused again. "She cannot act against a registered instrument." 10 days, Eleanor said. "I would like to proceed in 10 days. He looked at her over the desk. "May I ask why the particular urgency?" She said, "Because she will come to Leavenwood before August whether we invite her or not, and I would rather she come when we are ready." She stood. "Prepare everything. I will be in contact." She picked up the satchel. "I am keeping these." She was back in the carriage by 2 in the afternoon. Nan ate another apple. Eleanor sat with the satchel on her lap and watched the city give way to road and road give way to the country that flattened and then lifted. And she thought about what Dunnet had said, a week to prepare the formal instrument, and about what the formal instrument would mean, and about what it would cost, and who would pay it. She arrived at Leavenwood at 5:30. Hugh was in the study. She went to the study and set the satchel on the desk in front of him without explanation. "Pa." He looked at it, then at her. She said, "Nan's sister." He opened the satchel. He looked at the first bundle. He looked at the second. He set them down and looked at her and said nothing at all, which she had learned was the form his most significant responses took. She said, Dunnet needs 10 days, he said. 10 days, as though entering it somewhere. She said, after which we invite my aunt here, and we finish this. He looked at her with the expression she could read. Now, the calculation concluded. Something settled. And behind the settlement, a thing that was not quite calculation at all. He said, yes, and then, in the stripped tone, you went alone. Nankame, she said. He looked at the satchel. He said, I could have. I know, she said. I did not need you to. He held her gaze for a moment that had a different weight than the other moments they had spent in this room. Then he nodded, and picked up his pen, and she went to her desk to write her letter to her aunt. On the 7th day, Dunnet came to Leavenwood. Eleanor was not in the room. She had been in the study all morning with the ledgers, but she left at noon to walk the north field with Ned Kessel and discuss the drainage question that had been pending since her arrival. And when she returned, she heard voices in the study and went to the library instead and waited. He found her there at 2:30. He sat in the chair across from her, not the shaped chair, but the one near the writing desk, and he placed 3 documents on the low table between them. He said, Dunnet has prepared the conveyance. She looked at the documents. The first was the power of attorney, the original, with her father's unsteady signature. The second was a deed of full management authority over Ashcombe Grange, drawn up in her name. She read it carefully. The scope clause was complete. The terms were unconditional. Her name, Eleanor Vane, Duchess of Marlstoke, née Hartley, was written at the top in Dunnet's clear hand. She looked at the third document. It was the original deed of marriage settlement, the one signed the week before their wedding, the one that had assigned her husband certain advisory authorities over her family property as part of the financial restructuring. She had read it once before and not looked at it again. It had been altered, not recently, today, by the ink color. Every clause that assigned him any authority over Ashcombe had been struck through with a single line, neat and legal, and initialed at the margin. The initials were his. At the bottom, in the space for amendment signatures, Hugh Vane's signature was already there, and Dunnet's witness seal was already there, and the only signature missing was hers. She looked at this for a long time. She looked at his initials in the margin, 6 of them, 1 for each struck clause, in the same pen and the same hand as his correspondence and his ledger notes, and the 3 words "find a replacement" that had been the first thing he had written directly to her. She said, "You did not have to do this." He said, "I know." She said, "This removes every legal claim you have over Ashcombe. The debt restructuring, the management rights, all of it. You will have spent a significant sum and have no instrument to show for it." He said, "I know that as well." She looked at him. He was looking at the documents, not at her, in the way he looked at things that required honesty rather than precision. She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you told me I should have given you the document from the beginning. And you were right. And this is how I know how to fix a thing I have done wrong." He paused. "I do not have another method." She picked up the pen from the writing desk. She signed her name at the bottom of the marriage settlement amendment, next to his, and put the pen down. She did not say anything further, and neither did he, and the library was very quiet around them. And outside, the north light was coming in at a long summer angle that was not the colorless, steady light of the study, but something warmer, something that found the edges of things and showed what they were made of. Meredith Crail arrived at Leavenwood on a Thursday afternoon, in the carriage, with the good horses and the correct number of trunks for a visit of several days, because she did not do anything halfway, and she did not arrive anywhere without being prepared to stay. Eleanor received her in the entrance hall and not in a sitting room, which was the first signal, and her aunt registered it with the precision of someone who registered everything and said nothing until she understood the shape of the field. The meeting was in the study, because it was the right room for it, the north light, the shelves, the smell of ink and cold leather, and the ash of a fire that had been attended to too many times to pretend otherwise. Hugh was at the desk. Dunnet was in the corner with his papers. Eleanor stood near the window, and her aunt came in and looked at the arrangement and made no adjustment to her expression at all, which Eleanor recognized as her aunt at her most prepared. Meredith Crail sat in the chair across from the desk, which was the visitor's chair, the one that faced the document rather than sitting beside it. She looked at the papers on the desk, and then at Hugh, and then at Eleanor, and then she said, pleasantly, "You have been busy." Hugh said, "We have." He placed the accounting on the desk, Dunnet's full document. 6 years of Ashcombe withdrawals, cross-referenced against the estate records. He placed it in front of her and gave her time to read it, because he was thorough, and because giving her time to read it was the thorough thing to do. Her aunt read it. She read it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything complete, without rushing. When she finished, she set it down and said, "Accounts can be in error." "Yes," Eleanor said, from the window, "which is why we have these." She placed the receipts on the desk. 6 years of them, in their separate bundles, in the handwriting of 3 different record-keepers. Her aunt looked at them. Something shifted in her face, not collapse. Not yet. Because Meredith Crail was not a woman who collapsed in the first moment, but a renegotiation, the shift of someone who has looked at the field and found it different from what the map said. "Those were in my possession," her aunt said, quietly. "They were," Eleanor said. "They are not any longer." Her aunt looked at her, and the look was entirely without the smile that covered other things, which was the most honest. Eleanor had seen her face in 22 years. She said, "You are your mother's daughter after all." It was not an insult, and it was not a compliment. It was a fact being entered in a record. The formal instrument transferring management authority of Ashcombe Grange to Eleanor Vane is registered, Dunnet said from the corner, in the tone of someone who has been waiting to say this specific sentence, as of this morning. The power of attorney signed by George Hartley in October is superseded and void. He paused. The accounting has been submitted for review by a third party. The relevant period is 6 years. The withdrawals total. "I understand the total," Meredith Crail said. The room was quiet. Eleanor looked at her aunt and thought about the umbrella, brought to a clear evening, and the smile that organized itself for targets, and the cold stone that had sat in her chest since the wedding morning. She thought about useful is not the same as wanted, which was the truest thing her aunt had ever said to her, and about the fact that a true thing wielded as a weapon was still a weapon. She said, "You have 2 choices. The first is a full accounting and restitution of the total withdrawn, on a schedule that Dunnet will prepare, in exchange for which the review does not proceed further. The second is the review." She looked at her aunt steadily. "I recommend the first." Meredith Crawley looked at the receipts and at the accounting and at Dunnet in the corner with his pen, and she looked at Eleanor at the window and at Hugh at the desk. She looked at all of this for a long moment with the face of a woman who was deciding which kind of loss was survivable. Then she said, "Prepare the schedule." She left Leavenwood at 4 in the afternoon, in the carriage with the good horses, and Eleanor stood in the entrance hall after the sound faded and felt the cold stone in her chest dissolve. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way things dissolve when the circumstances that created them are no longer present, Nan appeared beside her and handed her a cup of tea, correctly made. Eleanor drank it, standing in the entrance hall, and said nothing, and Nan said nothing, and the house was very quiet. He found her in the library that evening. She had not gone to the study, and she had not gone to the dining room, and she had not gone to her rooms, because she did not quite know yet what the next hour was supposed to look like, and she had learned, in her time at Leavenworth, that the library was the room that did not require her to know. He came in and closed the door and stood near it for a moment, which was unusual. He was not a man who stood near doors. Then he came and sat in the shaped chair, the one she had avoided on her first evening here, the one that had been formed by someone who was no longer present. He looked at it briefly, and then at her. He said, "She agreed to the schedule." "Yes," Eleanor said. He said, "Dunnett will have it prepared by the end of the week." "Good," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and placed something on the low table between them. She looked at it. It was a piece of paper, folded once, the kind of paper he used for working notes. She picked it up and opened it. It was a list, handwritten. In his hand, the same hand as the 3 words "find a replacement" and the 6 initialed amendments. The list was dated from the first week of her arrival at Leavenworth, and it went forward from there. Entry by entry. Black tea. No additions. 3 minutes. Volume left open on the writing desk. Botanical. Not botanical illustrations. Practical use of plants. Asked Hesba about the name of the woman at the Northfield cottage. Stood at the window for 11 minutes one morning before she moved. The ledger she took without being told she could. It continued for 2 pages. Small entries. Specific. The record of someone paying attention in the only language he fully trusted. At the bottom, in handwriting that was slightly less even than the rest, as though written more recently or more quickly. I do not know how to say this in any form that is not this form. I am asking whether the form is sufficient. Eleanor read the list twice. She looked at the second page again. The entry about standing at the window for 11 minutes. She thought about the mornings and the tea, and the second place at the breakfast table that had appeared without explanation. She looked at him. He was sitting in the shaped chair with his hands on his knees, and his face at its most stripped. All the calculation at rest. And she understood that this was what it looked like when Hugh Vane, Duke of Marlstoke, did not know the outcome in advance, and had acted anyway. He was not comfortable. He was present. She said, "The form is not sufficient." His jaw tightened, very slightly. She continued, "As a complete account it has significant gaps. You have not recorded. For instance, the morning you told the steward to replace the fence on the north cottage before I asked you to, 3 days after I had mentioned it in passing. Or the fact that you moved your correspondence time so it did not overlap with when I used the study." She looked at the list. "You have left out a great deal." He said, after a pause, "I was not certain those qualified." She said, "What did you think qualified?" He said, "Things that could be verified." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Hugh." It was the first time she had used his name without a title, and without the buffer of a household matter between them, and she saw him register it, a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. She said, "Ask me directly." He looked at her. He said, in the flattest tone she had ever heard from him, which meant he was being more careful than he had ever been, "I would like this to be a different kind of arrangement than the one we made. I am not able to specify in advance. What kind? I do not have the precedent. A pause. I am asking if you are willing to find out alongside me." She said, "I require 2 conditions." He said, "Name them." She said, "The first is That you tell me things, not after they are resolved and not through instruments. Tell me. She held his gaze. The second is that the tea continues. He looked at her for a moment, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. Not warmth, or not only warmth, but a quality she could only describe as relief. The particular relief of a man who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has just been told he may set it down. He said, "The tea was always going to continue." She said, "Then we are in agreement." She held out the list. He looked at it. She said, "Take it back. Add the gaps. Bring it to me when it is more complete." He took it from her. Their hands did not quite touch, and then they did, briefly, in the transfer of paper, and he did not move away, and neither did she. And the library was very quiet around them, and the summer evening was coming in through the west window in the warm, long light that found the edges of things and showed what they were made of. She said, "You sat in that chair." He looked down at it. He said, "It seemed like the right one." She said, "Whose was it?" "A pause." He said, "My mother's." Another pause. "The careful kind. She died when I was 12. I kept the chair because he stopped. I am not certain why I kept it." She said, "Because some things you keep without an instrument." He looked at her. He said nothing. That was, she had learned, how he agreed to the things that mattered most. Soda. On the first morning of August, Eleanor came down to breakfast at 8 and found the table set for 2, as it always was now, and the tea already poured at her place, as it always was now, and Hugh at the far end reading correspondence, as he always was, though he looked up when she came in, as he had not always done. She sat down. She was wearing the new gloves, pale grey, a slightly better quality than she would have chosen for herself. Left on the writing desk 3 weeks ago, without explanation or accompanying note. She had worn them every day since. He looked at them briefly and then at his correspondence. Outside the dining room windows, the garden had changed, not dramatically, not overnight, but incrementally, the way things change when someone has made a decision and is implementing it in the only way they know. By action, rather than announcement. There were flowers along the south wall now. Not many. Enough. The rain that had threatened all of yesterday had passed in the night, and the August morning was clean and still, and the fields beyond the garden were the particular color of summer after rain, which is not one color at all but many, each one briefly itself, before the sun moves on. She poured her tea. He turned a page. Neither of them spoke, and the silence was the silence of Leavenwood, which had been a thinking silence and had become, by accumulation and without ceremony, something else. There is a particular kind of love story that does not begin with a declaration. It begins with a chair pulled out in a crowded room, and a cup of tea at the correct temperature, and a man who did not know how to say what he meant, except by writing it down and hoping the form would be sufficient. Hugh Vane never learned to speak in the language of drawing rooms. Eleanor Hartley never learned to take up the space she was entitled to. By the end, he had given away every instrument he used to feel safe, and she had stopped counting brass beads and started asking for what she wanted by name. If you are the kind of person who stayed for all of that, thank you. You have excellent taste and a high tolerance for slow burn tension, which are two of the finest qualities a person can have. Like this story, if Eleanor's method of negotiating her second condition made you smile, share it with someone who deserves a Regency Duke who expresses love through administrative action. Subscribe and ring the bell so you do not miss the next one. And one question for the comments, because I genuinely want to know, was Hugh right to keep the power of attorney secret for those 2 months protecting the strategy? Yes, but leaving Eleanor to live in her own house without the full truth. Or did that choice nearly cost him? The one thing the ledgers could not record. Tell me where you land. I will be reading every reply. The next story arrives soon. We will see you there.